The vampire king who humiliated a human servant without knowing she was about to change his immortal life forever. Have you ever seen someone suffer in complete silence while everyone else simply looks the other way? Well, that is exactly what happened that freezing winter night in a mansion filled with ancient luxury, where a powerful creature of the night committed the greatest mistake of his eternal existence. And the worst part is that it took him decades to realize it. Imagine this, an elegant winter solstice gala, hundreds of immortal guests in silk gowns and impeccable tuxedos. Crystal goblets filled with crimson vintage shining under giant chandeliers. Everything seemed perfect, right? But amidst all that dark glamour, there was a child hiding behind a marble column, covering his ears as if every sound were a silver knife stabbing into his head. And no one, absolutely no one, noticed him. Well, almost no one. There was Hazel, a young woman of barely 24 years old, with her simple grey uniform and a tray of wine glasses trembling in her hands. She did not belong to this world of millionaires and apex predators. She worked 3 jobs just to pay the medical bills for her younger sister Alice, who had also lost her hearing years ago due to a human illness. So when her eyes crossed with those of that child, Leo, something inside her clicked. She recognized that fear, that silent pain that no one else seemed capable of seeing. The venue was the Obsidian Peaks estate, a fortress of black stone perched on the frozen cliffs of Stowe, Vermont. Outside, a blizzard raged, but inside, the air was warm and smelled of old money and iron. The host was Lord Thane Sterling, the vampire king of the Eastern Coven. Hazel adjusted her grip on the silver tray, trying to remain invisible, but she couldn't take her eyes off the boy. Leo Sterling, the 7-year-old heir, was crouched near the heavy velvet curtains. He was considered the silent prince, the shameful defect in the Sterling bloodline, because he possessed neither the telepathic voice of his father nor the sharp hearing of his kin. He was considered broken. But Hazel saw something else. As the string quartet began a crescendo, a high-pitched vibration that rattled the crystal glasses, she saw Leo flinch violently. He didn't just look away. He squeezed his eyes shut, his small claws digging into his own scalp. It wasn't the reaction of a deaf child. It was the reaction of someone who was being tortured by sound. Hazel checked the room. Lord Thane was holding court near the fireplace, looking majestic and terrifying. His icy blue eyes scanned the crowd, but they slid over his son without pausing. He wasn't looking at Leo. He rarely did. The shame was too great. Driven by an instinct she couldn't suppress, Hazel moved. She navigated through the sea of black coats and red dresses, making her way to the pillar. She set her tray down on a side table with a soft clink. She approached the boy slowly, ensuring he could see her shadow first, so as not to startle him. Leo looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, filled with a terror that broke her heart. He looked at her as if expecting a blow. Hazel knelt, ignoring the stain the floor polish might leave on her uniform. She didn't speak. Instead, she raised her hands. She made a sign. Simple, fluid movements. "Are you hurting?" It was American Sign Language, the same language she used with her sister Alice every day. Leo's eyes widened. He froze. For a second, the pain seemed to recede, replaced by confusion. He had never seen anyone move their hands like that for him. He hesitated, his small, trembling fingers lifting as if to mimic her. But before he could respond, a shadow fell over them. The temperature in the immediate vicinity dropped 10 degrees in a single second. "She is trying to speak to my deaf son." The voice was deep, resonant, and cold as the grave. It silenced the nearby conversations instantly. Hazel froze. She looked up to see Lord Thane Sterling towering over her, a glass of blood wine in his hand, looking down at her with a mixture of amusement and absolute disdain. "What do you believe?" Thane continued, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "That a simple human servant like yourself can teach a highborn like him." The words fell like stones. The guests covered their mouths, their eyes gleaming with malicious mirth. Some laughed with disdain. "He is broken, human," Thane said, gesturing carelessly to his son. "He hears nothing. He speaks nothing. Your hand-waving is as useless as your short lifespan." Hazel felt the humiliation rising in her throat, hot and choking. Her face burned. She wanted to scream, to tell him that his son wasn't broken, that he was in agony, but she looked at Tyne's eyes, ancient, unyielding, and devoid of warmth. He wouldn't believe her. To him, she was nothing more than furniture that breathed. She swallowed her tears and lowered her head. "I apologize, my lord," she whispered. "Get back to work." Tyne dismissed her, turning his back as if she had ceased to exist. "And do not touch him again." Hazel grabbed her tray and retreated. However, something didn't add up. While everyone laughed and the millionaire vampire strutted with his arrogance, Hazel saw something no one else saw. As she walked away, a heavy oak door slammed shut on the other side of the room due to a draft. Leo jumped. He didn't just react to the vibration. He winced, clamping his hands tighter over his ears, his face twisting in a silent scream. A deaf child might feel the vibration of a slam. Yes, but they wouldn't look as if someone had just driven a spike into their eardrum. And then Hazel understood something terrible. That child wasn't just deaf. There was something else, something far more sinister. Over the following days, Hazel began to observe him with stealth. The Obsidian Peaks estate was vast, which made it easy for a servant to go unnoticed. She saw Leo walking through the halls, always hugging the walls, always avoiding the center of the room. She started leaving him small gifts to test her theory. She folded a piece of paper into a small origami bat and left it in front of his bedroom door. The next day, it was gone. She left small notes with smiley faces drawn on them. They also disappeared. Leo didn't respond with words, but she would catch him watching her from the top of the grand staircase, his dark eyes tracking her movements. And that was enough for Hazel to know that the boy was screaming for help in silence. One afternoon, while the sun was setting, Hazel found him curled up in a corner of the library. He was scratching his ear with desperation. Not an itch, but a frantic digging motion. His face was contorted with pain, but he didn't cry, he didn't scream, he just endured. Hazel approached slowly. She knelt at his height. This time she didn't sign. She just reached out a hand, palm open. Leo looked up. Tears were streaming down his pale cheeks, red tears, as was the nature of his kind. He looked at Hazel and then, with clumsy and slow movements, he pointed to his ear. "Pain." Hazel's heart stopped. She moved closer. "Let me see," she whispered. Leo hesitated, his body trembling. He was a predator by nature, stronger than her even at his age. But he was so small, so terrified. Slowly, he lowered his hand. Hazel leaned in. She brushed his hair back. The skin around his ear was inflamed, hot to the touch. She tilted his head toward the dim light. What she saw froze her blood. There was something there. Deep inside the ear canal, almost invisible against the shadows, was a glint, a small black object. It wasn't wax. It wasn't a natural growth. It was artificial. It was lodged deep, wedged in a way that looked deliberate. It looked like technology, but ancient, a suppressor. Hazel realized with a jolt of horror that this wasn't an accident. Someone had put this here. Every sound that entered his ear was being blocked or worse, distorted into pain by this device. That same night, Hazel made a decision. She couldn't leave him like this. She entered the game room where she knew Leo often hid. She found him sobbing in a corner, both hands covering his ears, rocking back and forth. With trembling hands, she reached into her apron pocket. She took out a small object she had prepared. It was a silver hairpin, lethal to vampires, but Hazel had wrapped the shaft of the pin in a thin layer of silk, leaving only the very tip exposed to hook the object. "Don't be afraid," she whispered. "I will be very gentle." Leo nodded. It was the first time he had trusted anyone in this house. He didn't pull away. Hazel tilted the boy's head. The air in the room became dense. Her own breathing sounded like thunder. If Lord Tane walked in now, she would be dead. "Stay still," she breathed. With extreme care, Hazel introduced the tip of the wrapped pin. She had to hook the edge of the black device without touching the sensitive inner ear of the vampire child. Leo whimpered, a sound barely audible, but he held perfectly still. Hazel felt the tip catch on something hard. She leveraged it gently. "Come on," she prayed, and then with a soft, wet click, the object gave way. A small black device, no bigger than a grain of rice, but radiating a faint dark energy, slid out of his ear. It fell into the palm of Hazel's hand. Leo went motionless for a second, then his eyes opened wide. He turned his head sharply toward the window. Outside, the wind was howling through the spruce trees. Snow was tapping against the glass. To a vampire, these sounds should be a symphony. Leo's mouth opened slightly. A look of pure, unadulterated wonder washed over his face. He could hear it. He could hear the wind. He could hear the settling of the house. He could hear the beat of Hazel's frantic heart. From his throat came a sound. Small, fragile, but real. Ah! It wasn't a word. It was a breath. But it was the first deliberate sound he had made in years. For the first time in his life, Leo could hear. Hazel covered her mouth with her free hand, tears rolling down her cheeks. She had done it. He wasn't deaf. He had been gagged. But before she could process what had just happened, the heavy double doors of the game room flew open with a violent crash. Lord Sterling stood there. He was panting slightly, having sensed the distress of his bloodline. His icy blue eyes went straight to Hazel, then to the silver pin in her hand, then to the black object she was clutching, and finally to his son. Leo had turned his head. He was looking directly at his father. Tane froze. His son had reacted to the sound of the door. His son was looking at him, not because he felt the vibration, but because he heard him enter. "Leo," Tane whispered. Leo didn't respond with words, only stared at his father with wide eyes, tracking the sound of his voice. But then, like something out of a nightmare, a shadow detached itself from the hallway behind Tine. "Sir." The cold, serpentine voice of Pendergast, the head butler, resonated from the doorway. Pendergast walked in, his eyes sharp and malicious. "Sir, look. I saw this woman inserting a silver weapon into the young master's ear. She is an assassin. She is trying to poison him." Everything stopped. Hazel felt the world crumbling beneath her feet. She scrambled to stand, clutching the black device. No, please look at this." Lord Thane looked at her. His eyes were swirling with confusion, shock, and suddenly a blinding rage, fueled by Pendergast's accusation. He saw the silver. He saw the redness around his son's ear. "You dared!" Thine growled, his voice dropping to a demonic register. "You dared bring silver to my son!" Before she could explain, Pendergast snapped his fingers. Two large security guards grabbed Hazel by the arms, lifting her feet off the ground. "Get her out of here," Thane commanded, his voice shaking with fury. "Lock her in the lower dungeons. I will deal with her personally." "Wait, please let me explain," Hazel screamed. "Look at him. Look at Leo. He can hear you." But no one listened. The guards dragged her backward. Leo, seeing his savior being taken away, did something he had never done. He ran. He ran toward Hazel, tears springing to his eyes again. He reached out his small hand, his mouth opening in a silent scream of protest. "Leo, stay back!" Tine shouted, grabbing his son to protect him. The heavy doors slammed shut. Hazel disappeared into the darkness. For hours she remained locked in a cold, damp room, carved into the bedrock of the mountain. She was accused of something she hadn't done. Her mind wouldn't stop repeating the same questions. How did that object get into Leo's ear? Who put it there? And why had no one detected it in 7 years? Meanwhile, upstairs, the atmosphere was chaotic. Lord Thane was holding his son in his arms in the private infirmary. He was observing how the child reacted to every sound, with a mixture of awe and fear. The sound of a dropped instrument made Leo jump. The sound of Thane's heartbeat seemed to fascinate the boy. For the first time in years, Leo could hear, but instead of feeling relief, Thane felt an icy terror running down his spine. Something was not right. And then the door opened. Dr. Whitmore, the family's personal physician for over 50 years, entered the room. "My lord," Whitmore said, bowing low, "Pendergast told me of the attack. The human girl. She injured the young master. Let me sedate him and examine the damage." Whitmore stepped forward, reaching into his bag to pull out a syringe. And then Leo did something unexpected. He screamed. It wasn't a mute cry. It was a guttural, terrifying shriek, raw and unused, like he had just seen a monster. Leo scrambled backward on the examination table, scurrying into his father's chest, burying his face in Thane's coat, covering his ears with desperation. He was shaking violently. Thane froze. He looked down at the trembling boy, then up at the doctor. "He has never feared you, Whitmore," Thane said, his voice low and dangerous. "He has known you since birth. Why is he screaming?" The doctor stuttered. "The child is in shock, my lord. It is normal after a trauma. That human girl must have traumatized him." "No," Thane said. The single word hung in the air. Thane looked at his son. Leo wasn't looking at the door where Hazel had gone. He was looking at the doctor. He was looking at the doctor's hands. Thane realized something. The boy wasn't traumatized by the girl. He was terrified of the man who had been treating his deafness for 7 years. "Get out," Thane whispered. "My lord, get out!" Thane roared, his voice cracking the glass of the medicine cabinet. His fangs descended. "Leave us now." Dr. Whitmore scrambled out of the room, left alone in the silence of the infirmary, holding his sobbing son. Lord Thane Sterling finally began to ask the right questions. That night, he locked himself in his private office and tore through the archives. He reviewed every medical file of his son, and what he found left him breathless. All the reports were identical, word for word, the phrasing, the punctuation, the diagnosis. It was as if someone had copied and pasted the same report for 7 years. Diagnosis: congenital auditory atrophy, incurable. Recommendation: continue suppressed isolation therapy. And then he saw it. A small digital footprint in the financial ledgers attached to the medical files. A recurring transfer of funds. Project Silence. Maintenance of diagnosis. The funds were being siphoned from the family trust. Millions of dollars over the years funneled into offshore accounts linked to Pendergast and Dr. Whitmore. It was a scam. They had kept the boy deaf, kept him invalid just to drain the fortune. They had placed a dampener in his ear when he was an infant and simply left it there. Thane closed his eyes. For the first time in a century, he felt a tear, a drop of blood leak from his eye. He had failed, not just as a king, but as a father. He had trusted the wrong people. He had ignored the suffering of his own son because it was easier to believe the experts, and worse, he had blamed the only person who had actually tried to help, Hazel. The image of the young woman, terrified but determined, holding that silver pin, burned into his mind. She hadn't used a weapon. She had used a tool. She had risked her life to help a child who wasn't even her own kind. Thane stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered peaks. He turned to the door. He didn't call for guards. He took off his heavy royal coat. He unbuttoned his collar. He needed to go down to the dungeons. He wasn't going as a king to execute a prisoner. He was going as a monster who needed to beg for forgiveness from a human. The darkness in the lower dungeons was a physical weight. Hazel sat shivering in the corner of her stone cell. The cold smelled of mildew and old despair. She had accepted her fate. The shame of being executed was only overshadowed by the grief of leaving her sister Alice alone. She buried her face in her knees, trembling, awaiting the inevitable end. Boom! The heavy iron door at the top of the spiral staircase slammed open, the sound echoing down the corridor. Footsteps followed, slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly heavy. The sound stopped directly in front of her cell. The lock screeched, and the heavy door groaned open. Lord Tain Stirling stood in the doorway. He had removed his heavy royal coat, and his white shirt was rumpled. He stood with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, his icy blue eyes glowing with a faint, restless light. Hazel scrambled backward, pressing herself against the damp wall. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, unable to meet his gaze. "I didn't mean to hurt him. Please, just make it quick." She waited for the attack, but instead she heard the soft thud of expensive leather hitting the stone floor. Hazel slowly lifted her head. Lord Tain Stirling, the Vampire King, was kneeling. He was on one knee, putting himself at eye level with the human servant. He wasn't looking at her with rage. He was looking at her with an expression that looked painfully, devastatingly human. Shame. "Hazel," he said. His voice a low rumble, stripped of all command. "I checked the files." She stared at him, confusion warring with terror. "I went through 7 years of medical records," Thine continued, his voice gaining strength but losing none of its regret. "I used the blood site to see the truth. I saw the fraudulent financial transfers. I saw the lies." He pulled out the small black obsidian device. "You were right. My son wasn't deaf. He was silenced. And I, in my arrogance, in my blindness, I punished the only person who saw him." He extended his hand toward her. It was not a command. It was a plea. "I am a monster, Hazel," Thane admitted softly. "But I need you to help me fix this. Leo is in the infirmary. He's terrified of me. Terrified of the doctor. He's asking for you." Hazel stared at his hand. The hand that could crush steel was trembling slightly. She saw a father drowning in regret. She thought of Leo, the way he had reached for her. "I need to see him," Hazel whispered, her focus shifting instantly from her own survival to the boy's distress. He must be in so much pain from sensory overload. Tain nodded, standing up and pulling her effortlessly to her feet. "Then let us not waste time." He draped his own velvet waistcoat over her shoulders. "Come." The ascent from the dungeons was swift. Servants pressed themselves against the walls as they passed, their eyes wide with disbelief to see the human maid walking beside the king wearing his garments. Thine ignored them all. His focus was singular, his son. When they reached the infirmary door, Hazel could hear a high, thin sobbing. Thane opened the door. Leo was curled up in the center of the bed, buried under pillows, shaking violently. "Leo," Hazel whispered. Even through the pillows and the sobbing, he heard her. The pile of pillows shifted. When Leo saw Hazel standing there, alive, safe, a remarkable transformation occurred. He scrambled off the bed with supernatural speed and ran toward her. He didn't tackle her. He stopped inches away, grabbed the fabric of her skirt, and buried his face in her stomach, wrapping his small arms around her waist as tight as he could. He let out a wail, not of pain, but of overwhelming relief. Hazel sank to her knees, wrapping her arms around the boy. "Shh," she hummed, signing as she spoke. "It's okay. I'm here. You hear my voice now, don't you? It's loud, I know, but I'm here." Leo looked up at her, a shaky smile on his face. He signed "voice," mimicking her earlier movements. He let out a small, rusty laugh. It was the most beautiful sound Thine had ever heard. Thine stood by the door, watching them. He realized then that all his power, his wealth, and his immortality meant nothing compared to the simple human capacity for empathy. "He needs quiet, my lord," Hazel said softly, looking up at Tyne. "His brain is overloaded. We need to take him somewhere soundproofed." "The library," Tyne suggested immediately. "The walls are lined with lead and ancient paper. It is the quietest room in the estate." "Take us there," Hazel said. It was almost a command, but Tyne simply nodded. Once Leo was settled and finally asleep in the soundproofed library, Tyne looked at Hazel. "You are right," he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I stopped seeing the sun. I trusted the diagnosis and let my pride blind me." His eyes hardened, the blue glow returning. But this time it was sharp, dangerous, the eyes of a king going to war, but that ends tonight. He walked over to his desk and pressed the intercom button. "Security," he said, his voice calm but carrying a deadly weight. "Locate Pendergast and Dr. Whitmore. Do not let them leave the grounds. Drag them to the Grand Hall, immediately." He looked at Hazel. "I am having a trial. Will you stay with Leo or face them?" "They hurt a child," Hazel said, her voice cold. "They tortured him for 7 years to steal money. I want to come with you." Thane looked at her for a long moment, seeing the fire in her eyes. "Very well. Then let us show them the justice of the blood." The Grand Hall was locked down. The music had stopped. The guests were whispering, trapped by the elite guard, who looked like obsidian statues. The heavy double doors at the top of the grand staircase swung open. Silence fell over the room. Lord Thane Stirling descended the stairs, radiating an aura of cold fury. Beside him walked the human maid Hazel, wearing the king's waistcoat, her head held high. Thane stopped on the landing. "Bring them," he commanded. 4 guards dragged Pendergast and Dr. Whitmore into the center of the room. They were thrown to their knees, disheveled and terrified. "My lord!" Pendergast cried out, trying to maintain his composure. "This is an outrage. I have served this house for 200 years. "Silence!" Tyne said, his voice of command slamming into Pendergast like a physical blow. Tyne stopped a few feet from the kneeling men. "For 7 years," Tyne addressed the crowd, his voice echoing off the walls. "I believed my son was broken. I believed he was a failure of my bloodline." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the obsidian device. He held it up for the room to see. "This," he said, "is a sonic dampener. It was found lodged in the ear canal of my 7-year-old son." A sharp murmur rippled through the crowd. "These men kept this device inside my son. They watched him suffer. They forged medical reports. And they did it," Thane said, pulling out the financial ledgers which he threw into the air, "to siphon $40 million from the Sterling Bloodline Trust." The room erupted in cries of shock and disgust. Treason was one thing, but harming a child for gold was heresy. Tyne drew a long silver sword from the scabbard of a nearby guard. He held the hilt out to Hazel. "Hazel," Tyne said clearly, "these men sinned against the blood and against you. The honor is yours." The room gasped, a human executing a vampire. Hazel looked at the heavy, deadly sword. She looked at Pendergast, who stared back with pure hatred. She thought of Leo crying in the dark. She turned to Thane and handed the sword back. "I don't want their blood." "My lord," Hazel said, her voice ringing clear in the silence, "killing them won't give Leo his childhood back. It won't take away the pain they caused." Thane looked at her, intrigued. "Then what do you want?" Hazel looked at the villains. "You said that device overloads the senses," she said, pointing to the obsidian bead. "It turns sound into agony. Put it in them." A chill ran through the room. Thane's lips curled into a terrifying smile. "An eye for an eye, a sound for a sound." He turned to his guards. "Take them to the bell tower," Thane commanded. "Insert a device in each of their ears and then ring the bells. Ring them until sunrise." Pendergast screamed as the guards hauled him away. Whitmore fainted. As the doors closed on the screaming men, Tyne turned to Hazel. He took off his own coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, cocooning her in warmth. "You showed them mercy," Thane said quietly, "by not killing them, but you gave them a fate worse than death." "They will live," Hazel said, shivering slightly as the adrenaline wore off, "but they will understand." "Come," Thane said, offering his arm. "Let us go back to the library. I believe I have a son who needs his savior." This time Hazel didn't hesitate. She took his arm, and together the vampire king and the human servant walked out of the ballroom, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. The night of the trial passed, leaving behind a silence heavier than the snow that still clung to the gables of the Obsidian Peaks estate. When the sun finally rose, the air was clean, washed not only by the blizzard, but by a terrible, necessary act of justice. The bell tower was quiet. The awful screams of Pendergast and Dr. Whitmore, sentenced to auditory torment, had faded with the dawn, a chilling reminder that the cost of cruelty was often measured in agony. Lord Thane Sterling, however, did not seek rest. He walked Hazel, still shivering and wearing his heavy coat, back to the library where Leo was sleeping soundly. Tyne instructed the new staff, chosen for their silence and competence, to remain vigilant, and he did not leave the boys' side until late morning. Hazel finally slept on a makeshift bed of velvet cushions in the corner of the library, exhausted by the emotional whirlwind, the fear, and the adrenaline. When she woke hours later, the afternoon sun streamed through the window, melting the frost on the glass. Leo was awake, sitting quietly, examining the patterns of the light on the rug, his small hand pressed lightly against the fabric of Tyne's waistcoat, where it rested on Hazel's chest. Tyne was sitting in a large armchair, watching them both, his face a mask of exhaustion and profound concentration. He wasn't resting. He was studying. "He needs quiet for now," Hazel murmured, pulling the coat off and trying to hand it back. Tyne waved the coat away. "Keep it. You earned it." He looked at her, his eyes serious. "I have sealed the lower dungeons. Pendergast and Whitmore are gone. The estate is secure. Now we must discuss your future." Tyne led her to his study. The room, which Hazel had only seen once before, under the dim light of impending execution, felt different now. The tension was gone, replaced by a strange anticipatory reverence. "Please," Thane said, gesturing to a seat. "Sit." Hazel did so, her hands folded in her lap. She was no longer afraid of him, but she was wary of his power, which was still absolute. Tyne walked over to his desk. On the heavy mahogany surface lay two items, a thick, cream-colored checkbook, its pages blank, but its value incalculable, and a small, ornate vial made of black crystal, containing a liquid that glowed with a dark crimson luminescence. "Hazel," Thane began, his voice deep and measured, "there is no mortal way to thank you. You risked your short life to save my immortal son. You are owed a debt that cannot be paid with simple wages. I want to pay it." He pushed the checkbook across the mahogany desk. It slid to a stop inches from her hands. "This is a blank check," Thane said, "drawn from the Sterling personal vault. You can write any number you wish. You can pay for your sister Alice's medical future. Buy a private island. Retire your entire lineage. It will be honored without question." Hazel looked at the check. It was a tangible object that represented freedom from all her human burdens, the crushing worry of Alice's health, the fear of eviction, the exhaustion of 3 jobs. And Tyne continued, picking up the black vial, his eyes hardening with the weight of his offer. "If wealth is not what you desire, if you seek to protect your sister or to avoid future fear, there is this." He held the vial up. The liquid inside caught the light, gleaming like liquid rubies. "The blood of the first," Tyne whispered. "1 drop. and you will cease to be human. You will stop aging. You will never get sick. You will be strong, fast, and beautiful forever. You will become one of us, a highborn by adoption. You will never have to fear death or a sick sister or a closed hospital door again. It was the ultimate temptation, the gift of eternal freedom from suffering. Tyne waited, his ancient eyes piercing hers. He expected her to reach for the money, or perhaps, seduced by the promise of protecting Alice forever, reach for the vial. Hazel sat in silence for a long moment. She closed her eyes, breathing in the cold, clean air of the study. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked rhythmically. Tick-tock, tick-tock, measuring the precious seconds of a human life. Slowly, Hazel reached out. She took the checkbook. She closed it deliberately, and she slid it back across the desk toward Tyne. Tyne frowned, surprised. "It is not enough. Name your price, Hazel." "It's too much," Hazel said softly. Then she looked at the vial. She looked at the blood that offered immortality. "And that," she said, pointing to the liquid, "is a curse I do not want. I watched you mourn a living child for 7 years because you valued immortality over empathy. I saw what power does when it blinds you to simple truths." Tyne was stunned. He was used to defiance, but not moral judgment. "You refuse eternal life. Do you know what you are throwing away? The chance to see your sister Alice grow old, safe, and protected." "I know exactly what I am refusing," Hazel said, her voice gaining clarity and strength. "I didn't pull that device out of Leo's ear because I wanted to be rich. Tyne, I did it because he was a child in pain. If I took your money or your immortality, it would make what I did a transaction, not kindness. True care. It isn't a job, and it isn't a reward for service." She looked at him, her eyes steady. "I came to you for money to save Alice. I don't need it anymore. You taught me that money is often the root of great evil. Then what is it that you desire?" Tyne asked, genuinely baffled. "I want a job," Hazel said. Tyne frowned. "You have a job. You are a maid." "No," Hazel corrected him, standing up. "I want a different job. I want to be Leo's governess. I want to be the one who teaches him how to speak. I want to be the one who holds his hand when the world gets too loud. I want to make sure that no one ever, ever hurts him again." She paused, her eyes locking with the Vampire King's. "And I want a fair wage," she added with a small, defiant smirk. "Enough to pay for Alice's education, but not a penny more." Tyne looked at her for a long time. He saw a creature made of bone and soft flesh. Yet she possessed a strength he had never encountered in his 1,000 years of life. She possessed the strength of integrity. Slowly, a genuine human smile spread across Taine's face. It was the soft, bewildered smile of a man who had just discovered a new color. "Done," Taine whispered, nodding slowly. "You are hired. You are his governess. You will answer to no one but me, and you will be treated as family." The passage of time, the Obsidian Peaks estate changed completely in the months that followed. Taine ripped down the thick velvet curtains in the east wing, allowing the sun to flood the marble floors during the day. He began learning human customs. He learned patience, and he learned to listen. Leo's recovery was slow, but miraculous. Hazel spent her days with him using ASL combined with vocal exercises. She held his small hands, showing him how to shape the messy, confusing sounds of the world into manageable words. An apple. Leo practiced, his face screwed up in concentration. Taine often sat in the library pretending to read ancient texts, but in reality he was observing. He watched as Leo's face lit up with joy when he finally pronounced his first clear word. Mama, his mother, lost decades ago. He watched Hazel console him when he was frustrated. He watched and he learned. He even secretly began studying ASL himself, using old videos on the estate's server. Ashamed to ask Hazel for help, but desperate to connect with his son. One evening, Tane found Leo struggling with a complicated sound. Tane walked over, his face unreadable. Leo shrank back, instinctively fearing his father's coldness. Tane knelt, just as he had done in the dungeon. He didn't speak. Instead, he made a sign. "I am sorry," he signed, his movements slightly awkward but sincere. "I love you." Leo stared. He looked at Hazel, then back at his father. Then tears welled up in his eyes, not of pain, but of recognition. Leo threw his arms around Tane's neck. Tane stiffened for a second, then melted, wrapping his large arms around his son. The emotional connection was stronger than any telepathic link he had ever known. Hazel watched them, smiling. She had saved the child, but she had redeemed the father. The estate was now filled with something foreign to its history. Genuine, messy, human laughter. Conclusion: the true measure of wealth. The story of Lord Thane Sterling, the Vampire King, and Hazel, the human servant, teaches us a profound truth that transcends wealth and even life itself. It teaches us that true power is not measured by the depth of your bank vault or the span of your existence. The king had everything: immortality, authority, and gold. But he was poor because he was blind to the suffering happening in the silence directly under his nose. He trusted his pride and his titles, and it cost his son his childhood. The servant had nothing, a crushing debt, a limited lifespan, and no power. Yet because she chose compassion over indifference, because she dared to stop and look at a suffering child, she possessed the true wealth: empathy. Empathy is the most valuable currency in existence. It is the ability to see someone else's pain, not as a diagnosis or a problem to be solved by money, but as a person needing connection. Hazel risked her life to hear a silent cry that no one else bothered to listen to. She refused immortality because she understood that life's true meaning is found in finite moments of genuine connection, not in endless cold power. The moral of this story is simple yet vital. Never ignore the silence. The loudest cries for help are often the ones that make no sound at all: the slumped shoulder, the flinch, the withdrawal. Do not let your pride, your distractions, or your belief in experts blind you. Stop, ask, listen, extend your hand when no one else will. Because sometimes the smallest act of kindness is the force strong enough to redeem a monster and heal a soul. Thine the King finally learned this truth. The greatest value in the world is not the blood of the first, but the beating heart of a good human. He learned that the true measure of a man or a vampire is not how he treats his equals, but how he treats those he deems beneath him. And so the House of Sterling, once a place of cold power, became a place of warmth. Word by messy word, laugh by fragile laugh. Because they chose compassion over indifference. They chose, too,